All right. All right, we are live right now. All right, hi everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Kylie from the Village Hall, and on behalf of our Create Waunakee committee, we've got Roberta Bauman from the Tribune as our guest correspondent, and we will be talking with John, the brewmaster at the Lone Girl, along with Kevin Abercrombie about the art of making beer. So thank you both for being with us. Kevin, I know will be joining us in just a little bit, but I'm going to turn this over to Roberta now to start talking with John about what it takes to craft some awesome beer.
All right. Hi, John. How are you?
Hi, Roberta. Nice to see you.
Good to see you. So I'm going to start this out by just saying I love beer, and I love your beer.
Thank you.
And I think a lot of people love beer. It's delicious. It's refreshing. It's flavorful, and you can find a beer to complement just about any season. You can have a stout in the winter, or a nice light beer, or something sour in the summer. I love craft breweries because they are able to showcase such a wide variety of beers, like your brewery there. You've got some sweet beers, you've got bitter, some sour beers, some nice malty, frothy beers. It is quite creative. So I guess the first question for those who don't know, could you just describe what is beer and how it's brewed?
Well, in the simplest form, beer is basically the fermentation of malt with hops to make alcohol. There is a rather lengthy process. Basically, there's four components of beer. There's basically you have water, you got to have hops, because if it's not hops, actually it's going to be called a grut, a hopless beer. It has malt, and then you also have yeast that actually consume the malted sugars. Basically, you mix hot water with crushed malted grains to extract sugars in order to ferment and create alcohol. During this process, you actually take those, once you create the sugars, a sugar solution, it's called wort, and then you'll boil your wort. At that point is when you add hops, and then you basically cool it down from boiling, move it into a fermenter, and you add yeast, and then you wait for the yeast to do their job, which is eat all the little sugars and create alcohol. That's the simplest point.
Okay. So with each of those ingredients, yeast, grains, hops, not maybe a little bit water, but not so much water, each has a way of changing the flavor profile of a beer. Can you describe how different yeasts will do that, and grains and hops?
Yeah, so we'll start at the beginning. So, grains is each component can add their own different flavor profile. So, for instance, when you use different malts, you can use malts that produce kind of a toasty or bready taste. You can use malts that create like a caramel taste. You can use malts that create like a chocolate and roasty taste. So all those different ways, and then you can blend them all together. You can add a bunch of different malts to create a very complex flavor profile, or you can add very simple ones just to get a little bit of a toast, a little bit of a bread component. And then when it gets to hops can add, you have a lot of, I always find hops very polarizing for people. Some people love hops and they can't get enough hops, and IPA. And you have some people that just don't like hops at all. But I always tell them there's hops in every beer, it has to be. But what you can get out of hops are very different. So if you put your hops in the beginning of the boil, you just boil it for 60 minutes. So most boils like 60 to 90 minutes. If you boil it for a long period of time, you don't get any flavor from your hops. You just get a little bit of bitterness. But if you add hops towards the end and you don't boil it and you do something called a hop stand or a whirlpool, then you can get all kinds of different flavors. For instance, people get orange and grapefruit, or real citrusy stuff, or you can get more of a tropical. You get like mango, papaya, or even some dairy kind of flavors. And then when you get to yeast are very interesting. we don't use a lot of different yeasts. We keep it down to 2 or 3 different yeasts. But if you drink a lot of, special beers, there's all kinds of yeast. You can get a wide variety of flavors. You can get stuff that honestly tastes like horse blanket. I mean, really interesting flavors. But most for us, we use the yeast mostly to either keep it very clean, where you don't notice the yeast is even there, to really focus on the flavors from the malt and the hops. And then sometimes for some of our Belgian yeast, we kind of try to get some fruity characters. You can even get like banana and stuff like that coming from the yeast. So all those things kind of come together to mix and get different flavors to different beers.
Are there some other additions that you've added for different flavors? Fruit, or I've even seen spruce added to beers.
Yeah, you can get a lot of different stuff. We don't add any spruce. I'm not a huge fan of spruce, but we definitely do add like fruit. And if you guys ever come, we add coconut to some things around here. Those are probably the 2 big ones for us. Well, we've done coffee as well. Coffee, stuff like that.
I remember I think it was a raspberry sour that you had that was just delicious.
Yeah, hoop hop.
That was one of my favorites.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. When in the process would you add fruit to a beer?
So most of the time, you want to add fruit at the end towards the very end of the process. So when you have fermentation where the yeast are consuming the sugar, the action can be very vigorous and produce a lot of heat and rumble around. And by doing that, if you add the fruit too early, then that vigorous fermentation will actually get rid of some of the fruit flavors. You'll lose some of those compounds. So you really want to wait until most of the fermentation is done. And then at the very end, you might pour in just all of your fruits and flavors then, so you don't lose those flavors because of the real active fermentation.
So with a lot of beers, there's like a 2-step fermentation process. You want to talk about that?
There can be, it depends on what you're going to do. Ours is primarily a one. I don't know if I would consider adding the fruit as a secondary fermentation process. A lot of times people consider, especially in like home brewing, everyone always worry about primaries and secondaries. We don't really use a secondary chamber to do our fermentation. But if you was to do like a sour component, a lot of Brettanomyces and other sour things use secondary fermentation vessels all the time.
Okay. So where do you come up with your different recipes for beer?
So for me, I was always a home brewer. So a lot of the recipes, I was a home brewer for 14 years. So a lot of the recipes that I had came from from home brewing into the Lone Girl. And then also even from starting to work here, you want to kind of set a broad profile for your beers. So you kind of pick some that you're going to have, and then you try to find other supplemental things that are going to hit different palates in there. So that's kind of how my mind works, is that I want to have these 6 or 7, and then I need to come up with different flavor components to add to those 6 or 7.
You want to maybe talk about the 6 or 7 and then the additional ones?
So for us, I mean, we have our light ale, which is speakeasy. We have our standard IPA, which is mostly citrus and pine, which is off the rails. We have our pale ale, which is a little bit more of a tropical fruit flavor, but just regular pale ale, which is lighter in alcohol and not as hoppy, which is our Yes Please. We have our stout, which is Sweet Baby Stout, which is a dark chocolate roasty kind of component. And then we have our double IPA, which is 2 trains, which is bigger in alcohol, real complex, hazy, big hop flavors. And and then probably Towhead, which is our Belgian blonde ale. I would consider probably our 6 main flavors. And then, to add into that, so depending on the season, so a lot of people here in Wisconsin, they like ambers. So we make an amber during half of the year. And then the other half of the year, we supplement that same kind of malty, bready profile with our Oktoberfest. So, those are kind of the things you try to go and piece into there. And then you have the higher alcohol things. So we make triples and quads. We throw in a sour for people and stuff like that.
What's different with a Belgian? There's something with yeast that's a little bit different with that.
So really, it's most of the time with that is really, so I would say it depends on what your driving force for the flavor is, right? So if you are going to make an IPA, the driving force of that entire flavor profile, even though you could use different malts, it is the hops. The hops are the driving component in that. For when you're making the Belgians, at least the Belgians that we make here, the driving force is the yeast. So the malt really is not the primary component, and neither is the hop. We do use hops, but it's not the driving. We want most of that flavor to come from the yeast. So there's yeast produce something that's called esters, and the esters actually create that fruit component, and that has a lot to do with how you ferment it during the process. So Belgian's like a little bit warmer temperature. It actually gets more expression of those fruity esters. So that's where that's mostly comes in for the Belgians.
You want to talk about temperature? Certain beers, I believe Pilsners, if I'm not mistaken, they tend to ferment at cooler temperatures and how that affects it?
Yeah, so certain yeasts they're more comfortable getting particular flavor profiles based on where you ferment them. So when we do our standard ales here versus I was talking about all the ales, all our regular ales, we ferment them about 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Or we do some lagers. We don't do a lot of lagering because it takes a longer period of time. But lagers like to be in the 48 to 50 degree range. And this is basically the genetic strain of the yeast and what they like. So then when I was talking about warmer, we ferment our Belgian yeast at like 72 to even up to 74 degrees. And it likes it a little bit warmer, and it ferments a little bit faster and produces more flavors.
So a lot of factors go into brewing a beer. I mean, it's not just the ingredients.
Oh, it's always the simplified form. I always say is it's time and temperature. So.
What about the names for the beers? How do you come up with those?
Well, the names come from a wide variety of things. We sometimes have a name that we really like and we tuck away, and then we kind of think of a beer that would go well with that name. And sometimes we have a beer that doesn't, we make the beer because we want to fit a particular tasting profile for the place and have a good idea for a beer. We make the beer, and then you're like, well, what are we going to call it? So then from there we go forth and we kind of come up with creative ideas of what this beer reminds us of or something like that.
And I remember you've had people weigh in on ideas for the name.
Especially in the beginning, we had a lot of people write on. We had a board out here that people would write name suggestions. We've even done some stuff online as well, Facebook, where people chiming in. We've used a couple of them here and there. I think Goldie Hops we've used, which is a Belgian IPA that we've made. So we've come up and used a few of them from always looking for different ideas. I will say that naming beer is actually one of the more difficult process. I mean, it's just, well, you can try to come up with a good name and then you look online and somebody's already used it, stuff like that. I mean, it's more difficult than it should be. Put it that way.
What are some of your best-selling beers?
Well, our best-selling beers, I mean, everyone likes the light ale, the speakeasy. Also our IPA off the rails, we've had since we opened, and it always sells really good. And then, during the summertime, we sell the heck out of Summer Lovin', which is we are selling currently right now, and sells very well, which is our mango wheat beer. So I'd say those are our three big sellers. And it also depends on the season.
How has the Lone Girl changed its operations in terms of, like, I understand tomorrow that you're canning. Are there some changes in the way the beer is being delivered to the customers?
Well, obviously we're not allowed to have a lot of people or any people really yet into the building. So it's kind of hard to give somebody a pint glass. So therefore we had kind of to change. We were doing a little bit of canning even before that. We canned the end of last summer. And but obviously when we try to still get our beer to people, we need to come up with a different way. So we started doing a lot more canning starting in March, and we've been canning as much as we can through now. We will be throughout the summer, I'm sure.
Did you have to buy special equipment for that?
Well, we bring in someone that does a mobile can company that'll come come in and we can hook up to there. And then there's also the local brewery, Carbon Floor, has helped us can a few of our beers as well.
What is your favorite beer that you brew?
What is my favorite beer? Well, I've used the same quote since we opened. I always say they're like my children. I love them all equally. And even so, some people tell me that can't be true. It is. But I'm a beer drinker by season. I'm a hoppy guy most of the time in the summertime specifically. I like a nice dark roasty beer in the winter. Even some bigger alcohol beer sometimes in the winter for warming factor.
Mhm. What about pairing beer with food? The Lone Girl has done a bit of that. Do you want to talk a bit about how that works?
Yeah, so that's kind of a big collaboration for us with the kitchen and Kevin and myself. That we have basically different profiles fit different food things better. Obviously, if you want to get like a dessert, it's nice to get a nice chocolate. You can do a chocolate and chocolate pairing. If you want it hops, we actually use some of our regularly. We use some of our pale ale to use in our regular vinaigrette, so it works well with certain salads and pairings like that. And then if you want to get a bolder flavor, you use ambers or big taste, and you want to use like a big hearty meat or something like that. So yeah, we usually have a good discussion on what we're going to do. And they do that on regular menu. Sometimes we do suggestions, but then we have special parties and stuff like that.
Are any of the beer ingredients harder to find now with COVID-19?
Well, I don't think that's totally came into effect yet. I think that might be down the road. We're not very big, so we don't have large hop contracts. So sometimes coming up, getting certain hops to do certain things can be a little bit of a challenge. But I don't think we will know yet what kind of effect the COVID thing had on ingredients. I think we'll be seeing that more coming into the later.
Mhm. Are there any new beers you're thinking of, is your brain kind of working on some new recipes?
Well, there's always a few things, there's always the request for a seltzer. So we've been, starting to look at doing some investigating into doing some piloting, I should say, making some seltzers. I've also tried to convince, I want to make a carrot beer. So we'll see if that comes through the works as well. But I don't know, we'll run, with this COVID thing, I don't know how many more. We might not do as many summer seasonals as we typically have. We usually probably run 3 in addition to Summer 11. I think we might keep it down to 1 or 2. So.
Did you say a cherry beer?
Carrot.
Carrot?
Carrot. Yeah, carrot beer.
Like orange carrots?
Yeah.
What do you envision that tasting like?
Well, carrots, of course. But no, I mean, carrots are inherently sweet. So you could kind of play off the sweetness in a carrot, and then you could actually probably add some sweeter hops with that. And then also if you was to put in the concept of using the Belgian yeast, which creates a fruit component in itself, you might get a nice happy marriage there. I've made a homebrew version of it, but I'd like to get it in here and do a little bit more piloting with it, and see if we can make it something that we want to get to the patron.
Okay. Well, I've asked all the questions that I had. Were there other things that I didn't ask that you wanted to talk about the creative process of brewing?
I don't have any direct questions. No.
Okay. How did you get into brewing to begin with?
Well, actually, I started home brewing because a buddy of mine kind of showed me, and I was interested in, back when you're younger and you drink a fair amount of beer and you didn't have a whole lot of money. They're like, hey, you could make this much beer for a very cheap amount of cost. And I was like, okay. So we started doing that, and the brewing, once you make one, and then you're like, well, that turned out pretty good, and then you make another one, and then the creative process going. And I will say home brewing was very addictive. Once you got rolling, I couldn't brew enough. Trying to fit all the flavor profiles and changing and seeing what's changing little components to experiment. I used to split batches and do the same beer with the same wort and the same hop, but use 2 to 3 different yeasts on the same to get different flavors, and then vice versa, keep the same yeast and use the same 3 different hops, so you can experiment along the way. So yeah, that's kind of how I got started. I like experimentation, so it was fun to trial and error and really try to figure out what was best.
What was the process of going from a home brew type of atmosphere to one where you've got all these big tanks?
Well, I always tell it's very similar, and then it's different as well. Obviously, I can't take the same worts and make 3 different beers, but a lot of it, the process is the same. This one, I obviously have more pumps and more levers to turn and things like that I would have had at the home brewer. But a lot of it has a lot of similarity to it. I like, a lot of grain bills, a lot of things as far as flavor are very linear. So if you knew what kind of grain and kind of stuff like that, you could scale up pretty easy. Some of the hops took a while to figure out for me, a little bit of trial and error in the beginning. Our beers weren't as hoppy probably in the beginning as they are now. Some people may not notice that, but I didn't want to make hops also get very bitter if you use too much. So I didn't want to create something so bitter where people felt like the enamel was coming off the teeth. So took it slow and did a little bit of learning as we went along. But I think things have turned out pretty well.
Would it be possible for you to take us on a virtual tour of the brewery back there?
Right now?
Yeah.
Sure. So I always tell everyone, we do a lot of brewery tours actually. I always tell everyone everything starts on this end of the giant hallway. So, we have our mill, we mill in all of our grains. We don't have a silo like a lot of people do, but we do have full bags of grain where we put all this into the mill and it mills it up and gets augered into our mash tun. Here's our mash tun when I was talking about making a mash. And that comes from there and it gets transferred over into the boil kettle. We have our control panel, which actually controls all the heat, temperature, and a lot of pumps. Down here we have our boiler. So here's the boiler, provides steam and heats up all of our water and creates the boil in the kettle. And then when you come further down here, we have, what you all were seeing earlier, and what was behind me is we have all of our different fermentation vessels and then our dry tank. So everything down here with the pump on the bottom. Everything that's covered on the bottom are the stuff that's actually that have fermentation. We have active fermentation going on in two of our tanks right here. You can see actually when yeast are consuming the sugars during fermentation, they create alcohol and they create CO2. So the CO2 becomes bubbled out of the fermenter. And then after it's done with the fermentation, then we have our giant serving vessel with the logo what we call dry tanks. They are all big circular ones here. And then we also have some additional ones that are out here in the hallway. Here, that are closer for people to see from the dining room.
Sure. All right. Well, that's awesome. Now I'm really thirsty for beer.
Oh.
So I have no more questions, but it was really good to see you again, John. And I'll have to stop by and pick up a growler.
Oh, great! Yep. We also have a whole bunch of cans. We've got five flavors in cans right now. So come on by.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you both for coming in today and doing this for us. John, we totally appreciated the tour of the brewery, that's for sure. Thanks for sharing the creative process for making beer. And we look forward to more creative businesses joining us in these interviews. So if you have a business that needs to show off its creative side, let us know and reach out to Create Waunakee. Thanks a lot, guys.
Cheers.
Cheers.